Good evening, everyone. Welcome. We're going to be led in the Pledge of Allegiance by Mr. Howard.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
If we could remain standing for a moment of silence in acknowledgement of people who maybe need our prayers or thoughts. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Mr. Howard. Roll call, Mr. Clerk.
Ms. Burton. Mr. DeRay. Ms. Green. Mr. Howard.
Here.
Mr. Lamar. Mr. Levenstein. Ms. Mineo.
Here.
Mr. Stridiron. Mr. Walker.
We're going to open the meeting with the public hearing for the Contract for Excellence. Ms. Roaring.
Thank you, Madam President. This evening we are going to present our presentation around the Contract for Excellence. I do want to emphasize that this is a set-aside within our foundation aid. These are not additional dollars. So the Contract for Excellence initiative started in 2007-8. It does not provide supplemental. It's existing funds that are stipulated to be used in very specific ways. There are 7 categories, and Newburgh has chosen to identify 5 of them this year for work. The first category that we're doing is time on task. Time on task permissible expenditures include development of grade level K-12 curriculum maps to include social emotional activities and units, direct instruction approaches to further prescribe teaching tasks and culturally responsive language, supporting next gen standards, supporting core curriculum in ELA and math, department grade level and professional learning communities, response to intervention student review processes, data-driven instruction activities, and integrating technology into instructional delivery and the ISTE standards. Each of the schools will be a component of this set-aside this year. The positions are assistant principal, ITF, and librarian for a total of $3.1 million. The second category is teacher and principal quality. Permissible expenditures here include district-wide professional development and culturally responsive education, learning, and language, supporting transformative literacy and constructivist approaches to instruction, professional development in the workshop model and guided reading in grades K to 5, funding school transformation specialists for ELA and math work at TSI and CSI buildings, and supporting family and community partnerships, as well as SEL. Each of the schools will be a component of this set-aside as well. Positions range from psychologist, social worker, and guidance counselor. The number of positions varies by building as there is need to have equity based on the formula. So we have 2.5 million. The third category is full day K and pre-K. Here, you can do faculty and support personnel salaries, transportation, and materials and supplies. We have 3 in-district pre-K programs, and we provide transportation support for those programs as part of this set-aside at $219,000. High school and middle school restructuring is the 4th component. Here, permissible expenditures include evening campus for undercredited students, district analytic data, dashboards, and web-based student management systems, MTSS for students, including school-wide positive behavior approaches, response to intervention student review processes. These are focused in our secondary buildings, including Temple Hill and Meadow Hill for their 6-8 program. The positions here are assistant principal and guidance counselor for a total of just under $1.15 million. And our last category, or 5th category this evening, is around our English language learners. ENL service delivery and bilingual classroom faculty, native language support activities, and curriculum and professional development for our ENL students. Each of the schools is part of this category. There are 23 faculty for a total of $2.4 million. And that concludes the presentation on C4E.
I'd like to ask if anybody in the public or any board members have any questions on this. Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Madam President. Can the Contract for Excellence money be used for creating a safe and secure learning environment in the schools?
The state has provided 7 categories, and that is not one of them.
Thank you.
Anybody else have any other questions? And I apologize, Mr. Stridiron. I know your face. Ms. Burton.
So my question, so this is money from the New York State Department of Education. It's been coming into our school district for a long time now. So how do we measure, when you get money like this and you have either new or existing programs, is it just merged into the budget? So how do we measure what the district is allocating the money for? How do we know if it's working or not?
Ms. Roaring?
I'm going to start the response and then defer to my colleagues who have been here longer than I have. This is not new money. It's not additional money. It's actually a set aside within our foundation aid. So the state gives us a foundation aid amount every single year, and then within it, it tells us that we have to spend this $11 million in very specific ways. So I do want to make sure that we're clear on that piece. It's not new or additional funding. In terms of measurement, I will defer.
Yes, Mr. Howard?
Thank you, Madam President.
Let's see if we can finish getting an answer on that.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
Anybody, Mrs. Moriarty? And then I'll get to you, Mr. Howard, sorry.
Currently, a lot of the money goes towards transportation and staffing, so creating smaller class sizes, providing the opportunities for our RLs, providing transportation for the pre-K. So those aren't necessarily measurable in academic growth sense of the matter. And SEL services as well.
Mr. Howard?
Thank you, Madam President. So I understand this is a state contract for excellence, but it does state that these funds must be given to districts to increase student achievement and to benefit students with greatest educational needs and lower performing schools. How is that measured? And I know they give us specific categories, but there must be some type of way of measuring how effective we are doing what we're doing with this money. Is there a way to monitor that?
I think that continues with Ms. Burton's question. And again, are we completing the units of study? Do teachers have the resources that they need? Are we providing opportunities to close the opportunity gap for our students? So I think it's in charting our course for the high schools, our opportunities for the Hill schools, so the work that we do with Dr. Hunter in the culturally linguistic responsive education professional development that we've started.
If I may follow up. So I understand this is have a teacher component and our school, our student component. So do we talk to the teachers and ask them how effective these programs are being, and also do we have conversations with students and see, or do we monitor their progress so that what I'm hearing is that it's beneficial to both teachers and students? And I wanted to know that we're doing the best for both categories, number one, but more importantly, that we're using the money effectively, efficiently.
So, yeah, the feedback from the teachers, we have the loops, the surveys, the opportunities for them to provide feedback in CPTs, professional learning times, professional learning communities, also in surveys that we provide with them. We've done a better job this year, I think, of getting student voice back and creating those opportunities for empathy interviews and getting their feedback within classes. But we're going to continue to do a better job at that this year for student voice and choice.
Last follow-up. So the money that we get, we have to use that money, correct? And is the money the following year based on what you did with the money the previous year? And by an amount?
There's no correlation there. The state tells us what that amount is going to be as a set aside within our foundation aid.
Okay, thank you.
I'm going to follow up, and then I'll call on you guys. Historically, have we seen a growing amount of money or a reduction in money? Because in the past, I know years ago, it was reduced and reduced and reduced. What's happening as a trend?
I can't be precise in that response because I haven't looked at Newburgh's historical information. I can say from my prior district, it has leveled off, and that amount has been consistent.
So the second part of that is, because there are salaries hooked into that, how do we ensure that we can safeguard those salaries and those people and those programs that are critical?
Again, it's a set aside within the foundation aid. So our foundation aid amount is continuing to increase on an annual basis. The state just tells us that this portion has to be spent in a very specific way. It's kind of akin to the community schools project that exists in many districts, where there's a specific amount every year that they have to spend on those focused activities in community school eligible buildings within their district. It's just the state's way of ensuring we're focused on certain things with a portion of the money they give us.
Mr. Levinstein, and then Mr. Stridiron, and then back to Ms. Burton. Okay, Mr. Stridiron.
Ms. Moriarty, you said something about class sizes. Is this money being used to reduce class sizes? Is that what you said?
Not this year.
Okay, because the teacher principal quality sheet, there's not one classroom teacher on that list.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
There's not one classroom teacher on that list for teacher
Right.
principal
It's
quality.
not being used this
So-
year, but it was in the past.
Any reason why it wasn't used this year for reducing class sizes? Just how do these decisions get made?
I think because we used a lot of the stimulus money, the American Rescue Plan money to ask principals what they need in their buildings.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Burton?
So yeah, we've been getting this set aside monies for a long time. And what is presented before us today is focusing on what the money can be used for. So I just want clarity is what so if we say teacher principal quality funding, what it says here is the following activities are allowed expenditures. So I want to know what are those expenditures, not what they are allowed to be. So I think for me, I'd like more clarity in terms of what are we spending this money on, and to piggyback on my first question, and wherever the money is being allocated, because it is additional, I'm using my terms, additional monies on top of whatever other funds that we get, how is it lending itself to improving academic performance? Because that's, at the end of the day, student achievement, which is what this is about. And, you know, it's to benefit the students with the greatest educational need and low-performing schools. So I would just like a little bit more clarity, and not this it's very ambiguous in terms of when you list here what it's allowed for, as opposed to what are we using it for.
Mr. Baird, did you have anything to say?
So I think if you follow along with the way this is laid out, there's these number of areas of focus, right? We've chosen 5. Then within that are the activities that drive that particular area. So if you follow along how it's worked, then there's how you then expend that money accordingly. And it's a broad range. So the answer to the question of the impact, it's a broad range to answer that, because there's many programs and then subcomponents of how this is being dealt with. So for example, when Ms. Moriarty talked about unit maps and common assessments, the reason why some of our administrators are in there is because we're trying to drive that with them to lead that work at the building level. Ms. Moriarty meets with the assistant principals and the principals on a monthly basis, as did Ms. Soto, to really talk about those areas of focus. A lot of it comes around theory of action, that if you have certain of these activities in place in a district, we know by research that they have impact. So if you have a multi-tiered system of support and you're using data to drive student interventions, then you'll be able to see impact on students. So by having that be the focus of the initiative around MTSS, the thinking is by having that work very, as part of this understanding around the set-aside, that if we focus on that, we will see student impact, using data which we've described in many ways, how data has been used differently over the years, how we're looking at interim assessments, how we're looking at common assessments, how we're looking at regions information to drive a lot of our intervention. So it's a broad range to answer, because there's many subcomponents that are indicated under the 5 broad categories, and for each they have sort of different ways to measure. Implementation of research-based supports is really an important aspect of, is this working or not? By having these things in place, we know they will impact kids. We know SEL, especially post-COVID, is a driving force in our work, and that is certainly identified under somehow how the money is allocated. So, to go through this and say, can I measure the impact? This could take hours, because there's so many subcomponents around these 5 primary areas that we're focused on.
Mr. Forget?
So what I hear from the trustees is that they are requesting that we identify interim measures to determine the impact that our focus is having around these 5 critical areas. So perhaps based on the feedback that we're hearing at this hearing, based on the feedback that we're receiving today, we go back and we identify for each of the 5 categories the measurable areas over possibly on a quarterly basis that we can report out to the board. I think that's what I'm hearing consistently from each of the trustees. If you're going to do it, how do you know you did it, and how did it change the life of a student? So let's take this feedback, go back, identify those interim measures, and then report out at the next meeting, if you don't mind.
Thank you. Go, Dr. Manning Campbell.
In addition to that, thank you. Also ensuring that we have student voice and teacher voice included in the process.
Any other questions from the community or from the board? Thank you. Be it resolved that the Board of Education hereby recesses into executive session for the following purpose: matter made confidential under FERPA, employment history of particular individuals, matters leading to the employment of particular individuals, the review and of programs and placement of students with disabilities, collective bargaining under the Taylor Law, CSEA, NTA, NASA, and to obtain advice from legal counsel. I'd like to entertain a motion, please. Roll call, Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Doré? Mr. Howard?
Yes.
Mr. Lamar? Mr. Levinstein? Ms. Mineo?
Yes.
Mr. Stridiron? Mr. Walker? Ms. Burton?
Thank you. I apologize. It took us a little bit longer than anticipated in the back room, but we're back, and we're at public comment on agenda items, and I'm going to combine agenda and non-agenda items at this time. So we're now at the section of the agenda for public discussion. Please refer to the regulations regarding discussion and comments, and remember you have 5 minutes. And we're going to start with Mr. Walker, who signed up for non-agenda items.
She's the first one signed up.
Oh, I'm sorry. Wait. Can we go to Ms. Boulay first, because she signed up first? I apologize, Ms. Boulay.
Good evening. Deb Boulay, Newburgh resident and taxpayer for about 30 years, retired teacher in this district, June 30th, 2022. Now I call myself a change agent. In July 2022, I publicly requested an accounting at this board meeting of how the district spent the millions of dollars in COVID funds it was given by the government. Others asked before me, and as of today, August 9th, 2022, you have refused to produce any reconciliation of these funds. I'm asking publicly again for an accounting of how this money was spent. I assure you that the truth will prevail, whether you speak it or not. However, for the good of the district, I implore you to take the high road and set an example for the new superintendent and the students and families that you serve. Next, let's discuss safety. I've attended funerals or services for 6 students over my career. I have taught a male student who became a murderer to 2 of these kids. I taught students who are now in the penitentiary for violent crimes. I've lost count of how many times I have been hit and injured, not for trying to stop a fight inside a school, but as collateral damage during a fight. This past school year, I was hit twice, once in the fall and once more, much more badly on May 6th. Every board member except for the 2 new members received my statement, which included the calamity of failures by NECSD to even try to help me, and the fact that I had to go to the police station to have an officer go to the school to look at the tape to tell me what I had been hit with is unconscionable. You received photos of my back, my spine swollen and red. I had to wait for 3 days for confirmation of whether or not it was broken. I received a phone call from the head of the teachers union advising me that after you received my data, you would do an investigation to determine how this kid was given only one lunch detention for assaulting me, and he didn't even serve it as he bragged to other teachers. The kid is a repeat offender, being thrown out of lunch duty over and over and over. No one in the district, not one administrator, and none of you but for one of you, contacted me to even see if I was okay. I heard from the head of Human Resources informing me that I was directed to return back to that lunch duty and stand at a station right next to that kid that assaulted me for the remainder of the school year. My accommodation request to not return to that lunch duty that was written by the medical facility recommended by the school district was denied. For a third time, I wrote to the head of HR and others 2 weeks ago asking for the results of the investigation, and I received no response, crickets from everyone. So despite me having several years invested in this district as a teacher and serving the community in countless ways on my own time, despite me working 16 hours a day regularly during the pandemic and being paid for only 7.25 hours, despite me rarely ever taking a sick day, and despite me paying union dues of over $1,000 a year to ensure that the union would protect me, not only was I not protected, I was ignored, disrespected, and dismissed. So I ask the public, if I can be treated this way by all parts of this system, how do you think a child is treated when they fall victim? Your system is broken on many, many levels, and you fail to respond. You fail to even recognize the truth, because I don't know if you know the truth. How many of you have walked through the halls of NFA on a bell? How many of you are brave enough to do that? How many of you have ever entered schools unannounced and spent the day witnessing the real deals? How many of you have experienced the horror of seeing a nearly 6-foot-tall male 8th grader pick up a 5'1" female student and slam her into a set of lockers as hundreds of students surround that event, recording it, laughing and shouting for blood? How many of you have even bothered to look at the tapes to see the violence that actually happens in our schools? You're asking the peoples of this district the wrong questions. Among things you need to ask administrators is for an accounting of how many times they downgrade the charge written on the referral by teachers. You need to ask for a report from Safe Schools listing how many total referrals were written by student to identify these heavy hitters and do something about it. You two need to acknowledge that there are not nearly enough guards in our system. You need to use data that is real and has not been massaged to make it appear as though nothing is happening. Parents need to pay attention carefully and accept nothing but safety and security for the schools, for the kids that are in each and every school in Newburgh. Thank you.
Mr. Walker?
Hold my presentation today because I want to end on what you said. I want that to be what stands out today.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Boyd?
Good evening, everyone. I'm coming here on two parts. First part is as the chairwoman of the Police Review Board. Me and the police department, we are in collaboration on many agendas. And one of the agendas is we would like for you guys to think about a career day, which would invite my board along with the police department, not only just for career minding avenues, but also for, to talk to the kids on a safety level. What better people would be able to help with safety agendas would be the police department, and we would collaborate with them. So that is a topic that we really want to have on the table for discussion moving forward in September. Second part, as Parent Alliance, we have agreed with the Superintendent, Dr. Campbell, to have meetings once a month and we're waiting for the next meeting to have been set up. It should have been before this meeting. And so we're keeping an open mind about making sure that this transparency is being accountable for everyone who promised. We don't want it to be a one-time thing. The group, the alliance is not going away. So we want that to be very clear that if we made a verbal contract about having meetings, that it happens. Second, cell phone policies. We want to make sure that we are clear and transparent on the cell phone policy because we want to know, is it universal across all Board of Ed municipalities? We want to make sure that that policy is for all. And the reason why is because there is an article that has been floating around. So we want transparency and we want accountability and we want to know exactly what this policy entails. If it's to cut off across the board, because there may be issues with that because we know kids and we know cell phones and they're not going to cut them off. So we need to know, is this going to be across the board, universal? That's it. Thank you.
Is there anybody else in the audience who would like to address the board at this time? Thank you. We're going to move on to our Superintendent of Schools, Dr. Manning Campbell.
Thank you, Madam President. Good evening, members of the community, trustees, members of the central office, staff. A little short, yeah. I'd like to share a few updates about what we've been working on this week. We'll be using student voice to develop this year's mantra. We are asking NFA seniors to share their ideas for the 2023 district mantra for the entire district. All seniors have been sent a form electronically to submit their ideas for words and design. They were able to submit multiple ideas if they would like. The deadline to share their ideas is Thursday, August 11th. I'm proud to announce that we posted, and within 24 hours, we received 7 responses thus far. We're going to continue to push out to make sure that the students know that we are very, very interested in learning about what they would like the mantra to be. Thus far, we've received a few, so I'll share: unity, community matters, upward, and together. Next, thing that I'd like to share, I don't want to take away from anyone's summer, but we're super excited to welcome teachers, students, and families back into our buildings. We hope that you have been enjoying the summer. I can't wait to meet you. I've had an opportunity to visit many of the schools and speak to some students, and please know that we're going to continue with the community conversations. We have added additional times and dates and opportunities for community members to come to speak to me. We're also doing some virtual conversations and also Spanish-speaking conversations with the community because we want to make sure that we're maintaining an open dialogue. The conversations have been very informative and very welcoming, so for that, I thank you. I'm working on my welcome back letter that will express my excitement for continuing to meet more of our educators, family and community members, and most of all, our scholars. Soon we will be inviting our board members for our welcome back tour for the first 2 days of school. That concludes my report, Madam President.
Thank you, Dr. Manning Campbell.
You're welcome.
We're going to move on to our Assistant Superintendent for Curriculum and Instruction, Mrs. Moriarty.
Thank you, Madam President. This evening, Curriculum Instruction presents items 5.1 through 5.14 as a consent agenda.
Would any member like to separate out any of these items? Yes, Mr. Stridiron.
5.7 and 5.12.
Any others to separate out? Yes, sir.
514.
514, okay. So I'd like to entertain a motion on 5.1 through 5.13 without 5.7, 12, and 14. I'd like to entertain a motion, please. Questions or discussion on the majority of those items? Roll call, Mr. Clerk?
Mr. Howard?
Yes.
Mr. Lamar? Yes. Mr. Levinstein? Yes. Ms. Mineo?
Yes.
Mr. Stridiron?
Yes.
Mr. Walker?
Yes.
Ms. Burton?
Yes.
Mr. Doré?
Let's start with item 5.7. I'd like to entertain a motion, please.
So moved.
Questions or discussion? Sir?
So the total on this is $434,000 for internet and upgrade bandwidth. Is that a yearly contract? That's how much the district pays for the internet service?
Ms. Peterson, can you help us with that, please?
So for district internet, this is the cost for all of our district infrastructure and network. This is a contract that is bid out. It is corporate internet, so it's not even through a local. It's state regulated. We do a bid a contract every 3 years, and this is the cost for all in-district buildings, network, and we did about 4 years ago increase our bandwidth with the last contract.
Thank you.
Any other questions on this item? Roll call, Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Lamar? Yes. Mr. Levinstein? Yes. Ms. Mineo?
Yes.
Mr. Stridiron?
Yes.
Mr. Walker?
Yes.
Ms. Burton?
Yes.
Mr. Doré?
Yes.
Mr. Howard?
Yes.
We're going to move on to item 5.12. I'd like to entertain a motion, please. Questions or discussion on this item? Roll call, Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Levinstein? Yes.
Did you have a question?
I did.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. No roll call. Let's go back to your question. I apologize. Go ahead. Sir?
This is, on this contract, this is all related to digital supports for the program. I'm just curious, was this something that was requested by the buildings? Do the teachers request this? And are these services, is there a paper form of this available?
So there is no paper form of this. This is the platform of which we monitor student progress. It houses our data, and it's the overall, by building, by class, by district, how we monitor the reading progress of students. And additionally, it provides parent resources. It provides parents and families and teachers and students in class access to our bookshelf, which is books that they can listen to at home or in school. And it also provides other updates and resources to use in the classroom and at home for parents.
Continue.
Can the board, if this is a data collection tool, and I'm always asking about data, if this is a data collection tool, can the board have access to the data on a monthly basis?
Ms. Peterson?
We know that that was a request of the board, so I work with Mrs. Nielsen and Mrs. Moriarty to work with their development company to come up with a board report based on the last presentation. So that meeting took place last week, and we're currently in development of a resource to give the board a report on growth and different expectations. They are in the process of we are in the process of collaborating and developing with them now, a report.
I believe we have to take the data from the reports to present because it's a data privacy issue.
May I respond? Sure. As well as we have to redact student names.
Are there any other questions, board members? Roll call, Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Levinstein? Yes. Ms. Mineo?
Yes.
Mr. Stridiron?
No.
Mr. Walker?
Yes.
Ms. Burton?
Yes.
Mr. Doré?
Yes.
Mr. Howard?
Yes.
Mr. Lamar?
No.
That item passes.
Thank you. We're going to move on to item 5.14. I'd like to entertain a motion, please. Yes.
Simply, it was just an odd, there
Point of order.
Oh,
It didn't say what the funding source was for this on the agenda.
okay, but I need to have, did I have a motion on this, sir? Thank you. You're jumping the gun a little bit. Can I have a second, please? Thank you. Questions or discussion? Go ahead, Mr. Lamar.
There was no funding source listed on the agenda. I was curious to know where this was coming from.
Yes, Ms. Peterson?
This is a general fund.
General fund, sir. Okay. Any other questions or comments? Roll call, Mr. Clerk.
Ms. Mineo?
Yes?
Mr. Stridarn?
Yes.
Mr. Walker?
Stepped out.
Sorry. Ms. Burton? Mr. Duray?
Yes.
Mr. Howard?
Yes.
Mr. Lamar?
Yes.
Mr. Levinstein?
Yes.
Thank you, Madam President. That concludes my items.
Thank you, Ms. Moriarty. We're going to move on to our Assistant Superintendent for Exceptional Learners, Mr. Bayer.
Thank you, Madam President. The Exceptional Learner Division has items 6.1 through 6.6 for the board's consideration on the consent agenda.
Would any member like to separate out any of these items? I'd like to entertain a motion, please.
Second.
Questions or discussion on these items? Roll call, Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Stridarn?
Yes.
Mr. Walker?
I have to abstain on that item.
Ms. Burton?
Yes.
Mr. Duray?
Yes.
Mr. Howard?
Yes.
Mr. Lamar?
Yes.
Mr. Levinstein? Ms. Mineo?
Yes.
Thank you. That concludes my items.
Thank you, Mr. Bayer. We're going to move on to our Assistant Superintendent for Finance, Ms. Roaring.
Thank you, Madam President. The Finance Division presents items 7.1 to 7.6 for routine consent this evening.
Would any member like to separate out any of these items? Yes, Mr. Lamar?
7.6.
7.6. Any others? Okay, I'd like to entertain a motion on items 7.1 through 7.5, please. Questions or discussion on those items? Roll call, Mr. Clerk.
Ms. Burton?
Yes.
Mr. Duray?
Yes.
Mr. Howard?
Yes.
Mr. Lamar?
Yes.
Mr. Levinstein? Yes. Ms. Mineo?
Yes?
Mr. Stridarn?
Yes.
Mr. Walker?
Yes.
We're going to move on to item 7.6. I'd like to entertain a motion, please.
So moved.
Questions or discussion? Yes, sir.
Yeah, this is about the contract with Ambient Environmental.
Excuse me, sir, put your microphone on. Thank you.
This is the contract with Ambient Environmental. I'm wondering, is this going to be used to monitor indoor air quality or anything like that with all the things we've been asking for? I don't know is that something that's going to be going on here?
This is associated with the capital project. We're required to do some air monitoring and testing throughout the life cycle of the capital project. So it'll be part of the capital fund expense.
But this is not involving anything to do with other school buildings?
Not at this time.
Any other questions or discussion on this item? Yes, Mr. Levinstein.
So you're saying this is exterior air testing? Because you said no buildings, so.
As part of the capital construction, we have different abatement and remediation work that needs to occur. In compliance with the regulation, we have to have that monitored and tested.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments on this item? Roll call, Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Duray?
Yes.
Mr. Howard?
Yes.
Mr. Lamar?
Yes.
Mr. Levinstein?
Yes.
Ms. Mineo?
Yes?
Mr. Stridarn?
Yes.
Mr. Walker?
Yes.
Ms. Burton?
Yes.
Thank you, Madam President. I'd also like to request to walk on items 7.7 to 7.9, the BOCES final contracts for 22.
Could you read the resolutions? Let's do one at a time. Let's start with number 1. Could you read that resolution, Mr. McCoy?
Resolution to authorize the Board President to execute a 2021-2022 Ulster BOCES contract. Be it resolved that the Board of Education and the Newburgh and Large City School Districts hereby authorizes the President of the Board to execute the final 21-22 contract with Ulster BOCES in the amount of $1,864,261.50 to provide cooperative educational services. Said contract shall be incorporated by reference within the minutes of this meeting.
I'd like to entertain a motion to add this to the agenda, please. Roll call to add, please.
Mr. Howard?
Yes.
Mr. Lamar?
Yes.
Mr. Levinstein? Ms. Mineo?
Yes.
Mr. Stridarn?
Yes.
Mr. Walker?
Yes.
Ms. Burton? Mr. Duray.
Yes.
I'd like to entertain a motion, please.
So moved.
Second.
Questions or discussion on this item? Roll call, Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Lamar?
Yes.
Mr. Levinstein? Yes. Ms. Mineo?
Yes.
Mr. Stridiron?
Yes.
Mr. Walker?
Yes.
Ms. Burton?
Yes.
Mr. Duray?
Yes.
Mr. Howard?
Yes.
Let's look at the second walk-on, please. Would you like to read that for us, Mr. McCoy?
Resolution to authorize the board president to execute the final 21-22 contract with OU BOCES. Be it resolved that the Board of Education of the Newburgh Enlarged City School District hereby authorizes the president of the Board of Education to execute the final 21-22 contract with Orange Ulster BOCES in the amount of $9,778,864.01 to provide cooperative educational services. Said contract shall be incorporated by reference within the minutes of this meeting.
I'd like to entertain a motion to add this to the agenda, please.
So moved.
Second.
Roll call to add.
Mr. Levinstein? Yes. Ms. Mineo?
Yes.
Mr. Stridiron?
Yes.
Mr. Walker?
Yes.
Ms. Burton?
Yes.
Mr. Duray?
Yes.
Mr. Howard?
Yes.
Mr. Lamar?
Yes.
I'd like to entertain a motion, please. Questions or discussion on this item? Roll call, Mr. Clerk.
Ms. Mineo?
Yes.
Mr. Stridiron?
Yes.
Mr. Walker?
Yes.
Ms. Burton?
Yes.
Mr. Duray?
Yes.
Mr. Howard?
Yes.
Mr. Lamar?
Yes.
Mr. Levinstein?
Yes.
Let's move on to that third item that we would like to add. Would you read that, please?
Resolution to authorize the board president to execute the final 21-22 contract with Dutchess BOCES. Be it resolved that the Board of Education of the Newburgh Enlarged City School District hereby authorizes the president of the board to execute the final 21-22 contract with Dutchess BOCES for the amount of $1,241,924.05 to provide cooperative educational services. Said contract shall be incorporated by reference within the minutes of this meeting.
I'd like to entertain a motion to add this to the agenda, please.
So moved.
Roll call to add.
Mr. Stridiron?
Yes.
Mr. Walker?
Yes.
Ms. Burton?
Yes.
Mr. Duray?
Yes.
Mr. Howard?
Yes.
Mr. Lamar?
Yes.
Mr. Levinstein? Ms. Mineo?
Yes. I'd like to entertain a motion, please. Questions or discussion on this item? Roll call, Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Walker?
Yes.
Ms. Burton?
Yes.
Mr. Duray?
Yes.
Mr. Howard?
Yes.
Mr. Lamar?
Yes.
Mr. Levinstein?
Yes.
Ms. Mineo?
Yes.
Mr. Stridiron?
Yes.
Thank you, Madam President. That concludes the items for the Finance Division this evening.
Thank you, Ms. Roaring. We're going to move on to our Assistant Superintendent for Human Resources, Mr. McLemore.
Thank you, Madam President. On the Human Resources agenda, I have items 8.1 through 8.19 for your consideration on tonight.
Would any member like to separate out any of these items? Yes, Mr. Stridiron.
8.3, please.
Against 8.3, Mr. Lamar? 8.8. Any others to separate out? I'd like to entertain a motion on 8.1 through 8.19, with the exception of 8.3 and 8.8. Questions or discussion on that majority of those items? Roll call, Mr. Clerk.
Ms. Burton?
Yes.
Mr. Duray?
Yes.
Mr. Howard?
Yes.
Mr. Lamar?
Yes.
Mr. Levinstein? Ms. Mineo?
Yes.
Mr. Stridiron?
Yes.
Mr. Walker?
Yes.
Let's move on to 8.3. I'd like to entertain a motion, please. Questions or discussion? Roll call, Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Duray?
Yes.
Mr. Howard?
Yes.
Mr. Lamar?
No.
Mr. Levinstein?
Yes.
Ms. Mineo?
Yes.
Mr. Stridiron?
No.
Mr. Walker?
Yes.
Ms. Burton?
Yes.
That item passes.
Thank you. I'd like to move on to item 8.8, please. I'd like to entertain a motion.
So moved.
Questions or discussion? Yes, Mr. Lamar.
Yes, I was wondering, who's doing this training? And afterwards, will the participants in this training be certified in restorative justice?
Mr. Baer?
So we're working with Dr. Kavanaugh, who's nationally renowned, and his group to provide the professional development. We used them last summer to build this out for our other high school campuses. And it's part of the work is around a committee work to begin to develop how to do community circles, sort of circles, things like that. The idea of being certified, that's not a title that we use. the idea is that we begin to have these embedded into our daily practices. And we want to make sure the new campus has those protocols in place as the other campuses do as well.
Any other questions? Yes, Mr. Stridham.
Have we actually used restorative circles in any of our school buildings? Because it seems as if the training is taking a long period of time, and last year we had some issues. So will this year have restorative circles so that we can actually fully implement the program?
So the answer is yes, and we've publicly described how, for example, South Middle School has used them pretty consistently. They actually track them through our data management system, the number of times that they've done them, and their success around intervening or mediating certain conflicts. I do want to remind the board that restorative circles is one component, and a lot of people lose that sort of perspective. Community circles, the culture building that comes with this is equally important, trying to prevent and develop a culture of learning and respect for each other. Restorative practice happens after there's been a harm.
Dr. Manning Campbell, I'm going
to ask Mr. Brancato to come up to the microphone, please, to explain. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Campbell. So I'm a former AP at South Middle School, so I'll just briefly speak to my experience. I've personally facilitated 70 to 80 restorative circles at South Middle School, which has reduced suspensions as well as recidivism, and I would like to thank Shantae Brooks for challenging me to go on that path. We changed the culture of the building, and many staff members are facilitating restorative circles in that space. Thank you.
Ms. Burton, you had your hand up, and then I'll get to you, Mr. Stridham.
So you use both SEL and restorative as like together, but they are completely different frameworks. So how is this training integrating SEL and restorative practices? Because SEL does not have to occur in circles. SEL can happen anytime during the day with anyone, anytime. So I'm just curious about how the two are being combined in a turnkey training.
Mr. Baer?
So we have a range of, when you talk about SEL, my understanding, if I'm understanding your question, is very broad. It describes a whole range of approaches, understanding your emotions, self-regulation, anger management, mindfulness, learning how to have respectful conversations, really the skill building, which we have programs, K-8 especially, that work around that Tier 1 approach. So we have those built out, and the restorative component of this is more secondary. It's one component of a secondary SEL. So it's really designed to try to deal with developing in students the ability to listen to each other and to recognize sometimes we use harmful language and harmful behavior. And as a result, by listening to the person that has a perceived harm, how do we resolve that conflict and make sure it doesn't occur again? So it deals a lot with the sort of the consequences of sometimes unfortunate interactions. I do, as I say, though, there's one component, building community and culture in your classroom so that way you use appropriate language, you understand your emotions within a restorative component is certainly built in as well. So it's one component of a much broader concept around what SEL is really designed to do.
Mr. Stridham?
South Middle School was used as an example. What about Heritage? Is restorative circles used at Heritage Middle School last year? And, could you give us an update, like where are we at in other schools? Are we going to get an update, like a report? Where are we at in each school? How many teachers have been trained in each school so that we can see the progress? Because right now, we're not getting a clear picture of where we're running it, other than South, and possibly at Maine. I'm not sure. So right now, it's just a nebulous topic.
Sure. Go ahead, Dr. Kim.
So I agree with you that we really need to see where this is happening, and we will certainly report out. But, you know, along the lines of Ms. Burton, restorative practices and circles, that's just one strategy. And if we're really looking at social emotional learning and teaching the whole child, then we're looking at impacting and embedding it in instructional approaches. And so restorative circles is one way, and that's a strategy. And so we will look to see where folks are trained in circles, what impact we have made, and what other strategies and solutions we're looking towards utilizing to teach the whole child. So it is not the end-all and be-all. It is one strategy that we are using. So we will certainly provide you with an update on how we're utilizing, who's trained, when are they utilized, and what are our outcomes, as well as what other practices are we utilizing for whole child instruction. You're welcome.
Board members, are there any other questions on this item? Roll call, Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Howard?
Yes.
Mr. Lamar?
Yes.
Mr. Levinstein? Yes. Ms. Mineo?
Yes.
Mr. Stridiron?
Yes.
Mr. Walker?
Yes.
Ms. Burton?
Yes.
Mr. DeRay?
That concludes my items, Madam President. Thank you.
Oops, thank you, Mr. McLemore. We're going to move on to the clerk of the board, Mr. McCoy.
Thank you, Madam President. I have the approval of the minutes from July 19th and July 26th on consent.
Would any member like to separate out any of these items? I'd like to entertain a motion, please.
So moved.
Questions or discussion? Roll call, Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Lamar?
Yes.
Mr. Levinstein? Yes. Ms. Mineo?
Yes.
Mr. Stridiron?
Yes.
Mr. Walker?
Yes.
Ms. Burton?
Yes.
Mr. DeRay?
Yes.
Mr. Howard?
Yes.
That concludes my items, Madam President.
Thank you, Mr. McCoy. I'd like to entertain a motion to adjourn this meeting, please.
So moved.
Second.
Roll call, Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Levinstein? Yes. Ms. Mineo?
Yes.
Mr. Stridiron? Yes. Mr. Walker? Yes. Ms. Burton? Yes. Mr. DeRay? Yes.